So, welcome back as we enter the final pages almost of our study of the Life Divine. We're in the last chapter, chapter 28, the Divine Life. In our last inning, Sri Aurobindo was looking at what it means to have a life of unity, mutuality, and harmony, and what that is in reality by contrast with what we typically experience, and we strive to achieve that in collective life, in humanity as we know it. That it's ineffective and incomplete when we try to establish it simply as a mental ideal. That when we try to base it on vitalistic or materialistic elements in the human personality, that fails. Communal ego rises. The grasp towards sensory gratification, the grasp towards what is good for my group, overpowers the larger unity that we aim at. He comes to the point that he calls for the emergence not simply of the individual soul, but the collective soul in its finer virtues, in its full deployment through our intellectual and vital and material life. Casting off as we go the ideas of recent political thinking that we could, in an efficient world state, establish a balance between individual demands and collective demands and arrive at a formula that satisfies all. We haven't seen that to be true. As he says in that last paragraph that we were reading in the previous week, if that is done, the soul of humanity will either have to recover its freedom and growth by a revolt and a destruction of the machine into whose grip it has been cast, or escape by a withdrawal into itself and a rejection of life. Man's true way out is to discover his soul and its self-force and instrumentation, and replace by it both the mechanization of mind and the ignorance and disorder of life nature. But there would be little room and freedom for such a movement of self-discovery and self-effectuation in a closely regulated and mechanized social existence. You may remember that Sri Aurobindo put into humorous phrasing a self-criticism that he had supported inwardly, and with his then attained consciousness, the formation of the Bolshevik Revolution, and then thought how ironic were the results when eventually they manifested. So he mocked himself a bit with that observation, because the Bolshevik Revolution had a truth behind it, but did, in its machinery, crush the individual aspiration and self-expression. So he's writing here in roughly 1939. We'll be drawn back to that context again. So we continue from this point then. There is the possibility that in the swing back from a mechanistic idea of life and society, the human mind may seek refuge in a return to the religious idea and a society governed or sanctioned by religion. So from government by state mechanism to government by religious authority. But organized religion, though it can provide a means of inner uplift for the individual and preserve in it or behind it a way for his opening to spiritual experience, has not changed human life and society. It could not do so because, in governing society, it had to compromise with the lower parts of life and could not insist on the inner change of the whole being. It could insist only on a creedal adherence, a formal acceptance of its ethical standards, and a conformity to institution, ceremony, and ritual. Religion so conceived can give a religio-ethical color or surface tinge. Sometimes, if it maintains a strong kernel of inner experience, it can generalize to some extent an incomplete spiritual tendency. But it does not transform the race. It cannot create a new principle of the human existence. A total spiritual direction given to the whole life and the whole nature can alone lift humanity beyond itself. Another possible conception, akin to the religious solution, is the guidance of society by men of spiritual attainment, the brotherhood or unity of all in the faith or in the discipline, the spiritualization of life and society by the taking up of the old machinery of life into such a unification or inventing a new machinery. This too has been attempted before without success. It was the original founding idea of more than one religion, but the human ego and vital nature were too strong for a religious idea working on the mind and by the mind to overcome its resistance. It is only the full emergence of the soul, the full descent of the native light and power of the spirit, and the consequent replacement or transformation and uplifting of our insufficient mental and vital nature by a spiritual and supramental supernature that can affect this evolutionary miracle. So, in one sentence, he's called for the psychic transformation, the emergence and full felicity of the soul placed on the being, for the spiritual realization, the vast allness that comes with the realization of Atman, of Brahman, and then the invocation of the supernature, Paraprakriti, so that it descends into this corpus which has been psychicized and universalized in spiritual consciousness. And that is the only solution. Again, the place where this could happen would be in a dynamic society that would be willing to effect an actual change in human nature, such as the laboratory in which he was living, in which he and the mother were working out the first attempts at the transformation of human nature actually. At first sight, this insistence on a radical change of nature might seem to put off all the hope of humanity to a distant evolutionary future. For the transcendence of our normal human nature, a transcendence of our mental, vital, and physical being, has the appearance of an endeavor too high and difficult, and at present for man as he is, impossible. Even if it were so, it would still remain the sole possibility for the transmutation of life. For to hope for a true change of human life without a change of human nature is an irrational and unspiritual proposition. It is to ask for something unnatural and unreal, an impossible miracle. But what is demanded by this change is not something altogether distant, alien to our existence, and radically impossible. For what has to be developed is there in our being and not something outside it. What evolutionary nature presses for is an awakening to the knowledge of self, the discovery of self, the manifestation of the self and spirit within us, and the release of its self-knowledge, its self-power, its native self-instrumentation. So what is nearer to us than our own self? It is, besides, a step for which the whole of evolution has been a preparation, and which is brought closer at each crisis of human destiny, when the mental and vital evolution of the being touches a point where intellect and vital force reach some acme of tension. And there is a need either for them to collapse, to sink back into a torpor of defeat, or a repose of unprogressive quiescence, or to rend their way through the veil against which they are straining. What is necessary is that there should be a turn in humanity, felt by some or many, towards the vision of this change, a feeling of its imperative need, the sense of its possibility, the will to make it possible in themselves, and to find the way. That trend is not absent, and it must increase with the tension of the crisis in human world destiny. The need of an escape or a solution, the feeling that there is no other solution than the spiritual, cannot but grow and become more imperative under the urgency of critical circumstance. To that call in the being, there must always be some answer in the divine reality and in nature. So this crisis that he refers to, again, going back to the Greek, the turning point, it's a turning point. You rise to the next level or you sink. The turn in humanity, in the midst of a critical circumstance, again, back to crisis. Crisis is still the current context because this quest cannot be silenced. It's alive enough in elements of humanity to gain even clearer and clearer articulation. And as humanity founders looking for a mental, socialistic, mechanistic solution to its problems and cannot find them, it will be forced to that which brings truth of being and establishes that in terms of felt unity, mutuality, and harmony. The answer might indeed be only individual. It might result in a multiplication of spiritualized individuals, or even conceivably, though not probably, a Gnostic individual or individuals isolated in the unspiritualized mass of humanity. Such isolated, realized beings must either withdraw into their secret divine kingdom and guard themselves in a spiritual solitude, or act from their inner light on mankind for what little can be prepared in such conditions for a happier future. This has been, of course, noted many times throughout the world's spiritual history, that illuminated individuals do sit with a cluster of associated fellows around and hope for better, try to influence the nature. Even there's the tradition in Taoism that the kingdom persists because somewhere in a hermit hut sits a Taoist sage who holds all things together in the harmony of his heart. But we will see that this is not sufficient to Sri Aurobindo. This isolation is itself a sign of weakness. The interchange can begin to take shape in a collective form only if the Gnostic individual finds others who have the same kind of inner life as himself and can form with them a group with its own autonomous existence, or else a separate community or order of beings with its own inner law of life. Again, the Gnostic individual and the Gnostic community would have essentially a consciousness housed in that which transcends mind, which is open to the importation of light and power and felicity from supramental origins, and can, even if they have not utterly transformed the vessel in which they sit, strongly influence and direct. It is this need of a separate life with its own rule of living, adapted to the inner power or motive force of the spiritual existence, and creating for it its native atmosphere, that has expressed itself in the past in the formation of the monastic life, or in attempts of various kinds at a new separate collective living, self-governed and other in its spiritual principle than the ordinary human life. The monastic life is in its nature an association of otherworldly seekers, men whose whole attempt is to find and realize in themselves the spiritual reality, and who form their common existence by rules of living which help them in that endeavor. Monastic, from the Greek word monos, single, alone, connoting that any monastic group is isolated into a kind of hermitage. He continues, it is not usually an effort to create a new life formation which will exceed the ordinary human society and create a new world order, because its aim is towards that. Its aim is not to bring that here in divinized life. That is Sri Aurobindo's aim. A religion may hold that eventual prospect before it, or attempt some first approach to it, or a mental idealism may make the same endeavor. But these attempts have always been overcome by the persistent inconscience and ignorance of our human vital nature. For that nature is an obstacle which no mere idealism or incomplete spiritual aspiration can change in its recalcitrant mass or permanently dominate. Either the endeavor fails by its own imperfection, or it is invaded by the imperfection of the outside world and sinks from the shining height of its aspiration to something mixed and inferior on the ordinary human level. A common spiritual life, meant to express the spiritual and not the mental, vital, and physical being, must found and maintain itself on greater values than the mental, vital, physical values of the ordinary human society. If it is not so founded, it will be merely the normal human society with a difference. An entirely new consciousness in many individuals, transforming their whole being, transforming their mental, vital, and physical nature self, is needed for the new life to appear. Only such a transformation of the general mind, life, body nature can bring into being a new worthwhile collective existence. The evolutionary nisus must tend not merely to create a new type of mental beings, but another order of beings who have raised their whole existence from our present mentalized animality to a greater spiritual level of the earth nature. And again, nisus means effort. What he's aiming at here, then, is an elevated group life that aims to change not simply the mental perspective, but the vital and material basis for social life too. Now, clearly Sri Aurobindo's ashram is that. But in older India, in the Tantric tradition, that is stated directly as one of its aims, that the individual perfection should be collectivized. And one finds that articulated in the Sri Vidya tradition, which at least in part constellates some of the best of the teachings of Abhinava Gupta from Kashmir Shaivism, what they call the Trika philosophy. So this ideal has been seen and felt, and we know that it needs to be vibrant in life, but none has been able to change it. Sri Aurobindo is aiming at a different basis, not simply awakening to the spiritual values, but bringing down the forces and the powers of supernature, which have a supramental origin, into the play of earth life. Any such complete transformation of the earth life in a number of human beings could not establish itself altogether at once. Even when the turning point, crisis, even when the turning point has been reached, the decisive line crossed, the new life in its beginnings would have to pass through a period of ordeal and arduous development. A general change from the old consciousness, taking up the whole life into the spiritual principle, would be the necessary first step. The preparation for this might be long, and the transformation itself, once begun, proceed by stages. In the individual, it might after a certain point be rapid and even affect itself by a bound, an evolutionary saltus. But an individual transformation would not be the creation of a new type of beings or a new collective life. Saltus means a breach or a jump to a waiting conclusion, from the Latin, which means leap. So the individual solution, however dominantly realized in the form that it contains, because consciousness contains the form, is not enough in Sri Aurobindo's estimation. It has to be collectivized. It has to be given social dynamic form. The person may become perfect, but the all has to be represented as well, and the cosmos, or the all, is represented in the social group, in the Gnostic collectivity. So around the illumined individual must gather others who also are illumined or become illumined by dint of proximity, by the power of the force penetrating their conscious being. He continues, one might conceive of a number of individuals thus evolving separately in the midst of the old life and then joining together to establish the nucleus of the new existence. But it is not likely that nature would operate in this fashion, and it would be difficult for the individual to arrive at a complete change while still enclosed in the life of the lower nature. At a certain stage, it might be necessary to follow the age-long device of the separate community, but with a double purpose. First, to provide a secure atmosphere, a place and life apart, in which the consciousness of the individual might concentrate on its evolution in surroundings where all was turned and centered towards the one endeavor, and next, when things were ready, to formulate and develop the new life in those surroundings and in this prepared spiritual atmosphere. If you intuit that Sri Aurobindo is writing here modestly about the ashram named after him, I would agree with you. I think he is too. I think he's writing about the ashram that existed even before it was an ashram, from the time the mother rejoined him in 1920 to the period in which he is writing here, 1940. So, even if separate, first to secure and then to develop the integrity of the group, to expand from the basis of realization. A double point of illumination at the center of this ashram then spreads through other awakened and awakening individuals, and do mark that it wasn't that only Mother and Sri Aurobindo were examples of luminous life in the ashram. Others sparked, grew into flames themselves, even if they didn't advertise, even if they didn't set up their own separate shops. They remained quietly part of a harmonic spiritual life around Mother and Sri Aurobindo. It might be that in such a concentration of effort, all the difficulties of the change would present themselves with a concentrated force. For each seeker, carrying in himself the possibilities, but also the imperfections of a world that has to be transformed, would bring in not only his capacities, but his difficulties and the oppositions of the old nature, and mixed together in the restricted circle of a small and close common life, these might assume a considerably enhanced force of obstruction, which would tend to counterbalance the enhanced power and concentration of the forces making for the evolution. This is a difficulty that has broken in the past all the efforts of mental man to evolve something better and more true and harmonious than the ordinary mental and vital life. But if nature is ready and has taken her evolutionary decision, or if the power of the spirit descending from the higher planes is sufficiently strong, the difficulty would be overcome and a first evolutionary formation or formations would be possible. And he's talking here about establishing the truth of a Gnostic life on earth in a social group. But if an inner, but if an entire reliance upon the guiding light and will, chit tapas, but if an entire reliance upon the guiding light and will and a luminous expression of the truth of the Spirit in life are to be the law, that would seem to presuppose a Gnostic world, a world in which the consciousness of all its beings was founded on this basis. There, it can be understood that the life interchange of Gnostic individuals in a Gnostic community or communities would be by its very nature, an understanding and harmonious process. But here, actually, there would be a life of Gnostic beings proceeding within or side by side with a life of beings in the ignorance, attempting to emerge in it or out of it, and yet the law of the two lives would seem to be contrary and to offend against each other. A complete seclusion or separation of the life of a spiritual community from the life of the ignorance would then seem to impose itself. For otherwise, a compromise between the two lives would be necessary, and with the compromise, a danger of contamination or incompleteness of the greater existence. Two different and incompatible principles of existence would be in contact, and even though the greater would influence the lesser, the smaller life would also have its effect on the greater, since such mutual impact is the law of all contiguity and interchange. Contiguity from the Latin, meaning touching on all sides. So not just points of contact, but total touching, all being touching all being. But remember, he has written in earlier pages that the Gnostic consciousness, even in the life of the ignorance, would have an overwhelming influence such that it would mediate and manage and alleviate the strength of the ignorance and bring it more and more towards light. Don't forget those words. It might even be questioned whether conflict and collision would not be the first rule of their relation, since in the life of the ignorance there is present and active the formidable influence of those forces of darkness, supporters of evil and violence, whose interest it is to contaminate or destroy all higher light that enters into the human existence. An opposition and intolerance or even a persecution of all that is new or tries to rise above or break away from the established order of the human ignorance, or if it is victorious, an intrusion of the lower forces into it, an acceptance by the world more dangerous than its opposition, and in the end, an extinction, a lowering or a contamination of the new principle of life, have been a frequent phenomenon of the past. That opposition might be still more violent, and a frustration might be still more likely if a radically new light or new power were to claim the earth for its heritage. So even in past assays, where the Spirit was trying to gain ground in humanity, at each attempt, the dark forces would gather and repel or pierce and wound and eliminate the force of the attempt. This is, as Sri Aurobindo was writing with some of his correspondence back during these years, what he called HF and Co., Hostile Forces and Company. Still at work, they have a lifetime contract until we eliminate the reason for their being here by changing ourselves. But it is to be supposed that the new and completer light would bring also a new and completer power. It might not be necessary for it to be entirely separate. It might establish itself in so many islets, and from there spread through the whole, spread through the old life, throwing out upon it its own influences and filtrations, gaining upon it, bringing to it a help and illumination, which a new aspiration in mankind might after a time begin to understand and welcome. So this Gnostic life empowers unity, mutuality, and harmony. An islet, of course, is a small island. And you'll remember back in the decades, 70s and 80s, etc., that there came into play the idea that there would be these points of illumination, points of light, which would form a network of light, which somehow fell into the minds of speechwriters for George H.W. Bush, and then he referred to 1,000 points of light and was mocked by his Republican Party thereafter and driven away from this aspiration towards a larger unity. A pity, because it was something trying to press into the then political mind of America. But these are evidently problems of the transition, of the evolution before the full and victorious reversal of the manifesting force has taken place, and the life of the Gnostic being becomes as much as that of the mental being an established part of the terrestrial world order. So he does see that it gets placed alongside and eventually superior to the power of humanity. The Gnostic life would be co-present with the mental life of humanity. If we suppose the Gnostic consciousness to be established in the earth life, the power and knowledge at its disposal would be much greater than the power and knowledge of mental man, and the life of a community of Gnostic beings, supposing it to be separate, would be as safe against attack as the organized life of man against any attack by a lower species. But as this knowledge and the very principle of the Gnostic nature would ensure a luminous unity in the common life of Gnostic beings, so also it would be sufficient to ensure a dominating harmony and reconciliation between the two types of life. So, unity and harmony present. Mutuality is a part of them. The influence of the supramental principle on earth would fall upon the life of the ignorance and impose harmony on it within its limits. So as much as the field of ignorance could accept harmony and unity, it would be so. It would be able to participate in the life of the supernature as it establishes itself on earth. It is conceivable that the Gnostic life would be separate, but it would surely admit within its borders as much of human life as was turned towards spirituality and in progress towards the heights. The rest might organize itself mainly on the mental principle and on the old foundations, but helped and influenced by a recognizable greater knowledge, it would be likely to do so on lines of a completer harmonization of which the human collectivity is not yet capable. Here also, however, the mind can only forecast probabilities and possibilities. The supramental principle in supernature would itself determine, according to the truth of things, the balance of a new world order. This is a phrase that is assonant with things that he wrote in his letters on yoga. So, when he speaks here about things being determined according to the truth of things, again, this is a reference, without bringing in the Vedic, to Rita Chit, the truth, conscious, and ordering principle of the supramental awareness. It brings with it harmony. It creates a cosmos where there was chaos, in other words, an order. Unity and oneness are part of the harmonic order in the supramental vision. A Gnostic supernature transcends all the values of our normal ignorant nature. Our standards and values are created by ignorance and therefore cannot determine the life of supernature. At the same time, our present nature is a derivation from supernature and is not a pure ignorance, but a half-knowledge. It is therefore reasonable to suppose that whatever spiritual truth there is in or behind its standards and values will reappear in the higher life, not as standards, but as elements transformed, uplifted out of the ignorance and raised into the true harmony of a more luminous existence. The supernature emerges through the process of evolution because it is always present, hidden behind the structure of the surface nature. So when we contact elements in our being which seem to be discordant and expose them to light, they can refer back to and reform, refashion, re-image themselves as expressions of that greater truth. So things may be dark, but light is effulgent behind the veil of darkness, ready to shine forth. As the universalized spiritual individual sheds the limited personality, the ego, as he rises beyond mind to a completer knowledge in supernature, the conflicting ideals of the mind must fall away from him, but what is true behind them will remain in the life of supernature. Because they are pale reflections. They are iconic of a greater truth. The Gnostic consciousness is a consciousness in which all contradictions are canceled or fused into each other in a higher light of seeing and being, in a unified self-knowledge and world knowledge. Remember in Sri Aurobindo's pithy expression that the opposite of truth is not a falsehood, but another truth. The Gnostic being will not accept the mind's ideals and standards. He will not be moved to live for himself, for his ego, or for humanity, or for others, or for the community, or for the state. For he will be aware of something greater than these half-truths of the divine reality. And it is for that he will live, for its will in himself and in all, in a spirit of large universality, in the light of the will of the transcendence. For the same reason, there can be no conflict between self-affirmation and altruism in the Gnostic life. For the self of the Gnostic being is one with the self of all. No conflict between the ideal of individualism and the collective ideal, for both are terms of a greater reality, and only insofar as either expresses the reality or their fulfillment serves the will of the reality, can they have a value for his spirit. But at the same time, What is true in the mental ideals and dimly figured in them will be fulfilled in his existence. For while his consciousness exceeds the human values so that he cannot substitute mankind or the community or the state or others or himself for God, the affirmation of the divine in himself and a sense of the divine in others and the sense of oneness with humanity, with all other beings, with all the world because of the divine in them, and a lead towards a greater and better affirmation of the growing reality in them will be part of his life action. But what he shall do will be decided by the truth of the knowledge and will in him. A total and infinite truth that is not bound by any single mental law or standard, but acts with freedom in the whole reality, with respect for each truth in its place, and with a clear knowledge of the forces at work and the intention and the manifesting divine nisus at each step of cosmic evolution and in each event and circumstance. Next week, we finish our reading of the Life Divine. That is a harmonic note on which to end this week's reading. There are so many passages in Savitri calling to be read. I have to limit myself to one. This one I take from near the end of the poem, from Book 11, the Book of Everlasting Day. The soul's choice and supreme consummation. But when the hour of the divine draws near, the mighty mother shall take birth in time, and God be born into the human clay, in forms made ready by your human lives. Then shall the truth supreme be given to men. There is a being beyond the being of mind, an immeasurable cast into many forms, a miracle of the multitudinous one. There is a consciousness mind cannot touch, its speech cannot utter, nor its thought reveal. It has no home on earth, no center in man, yet is the source of all things thought and done, the fount of the creation and its works. It is the origin of all truth here, the sun orb of mind's fragmentary rays, infinity's heaven that spills the rain of God, the immense that calls to man to expand the spirit, the wide aim that justifies his narrow attempts, a channel for the little he tastes of bliss. Some shall be made the glory's receptacles and vehicles of the Eternal's luminous power. These are the high forerunners, the heads of time, the great deliverers of earth-bound mind, the high transfigurers of human clay, the firstborn of a new supernal race. The incarnate dual power shall open God's door, eternal supermind touch earthly time. The Superman shall wake in mortal man, and manifest the hidden demigod, or grow into the God-light and God-force, revealing the secret deity in the cave. Then shall the earth be touched by the Supreme. His bright unveiled transcendence shall illumine the mind and heart, and force the life and act to interpret his inexpressible mystery in a heavenly alphabet of divinity's signs. His living cosmic spirit shall enring, annulling the decree of death and pain, erasing the formulas of the ignorance with the deep meaning of beauty and life's hid sense, the being ready for immortality, his regard crossing infinity's mystic waves, bring back to nature her early joy to live, the metered heartbeats of a lost delight, the cry of a forgotten ecstasy, the dance of the first world-creating bliss. The immanent shall be the witness God, watching on his many-petaled lotus throne, his actionless being and his silent might, ruling earth nature by eternity's law, a thinker waking the inconscious world, an immobile center of many infinitudes in his thousand-pillared temple by time's sea. Then shall the embodied being live as one, who is a thought, a will of the divine, a mask or robe of his divinity, an instrument and partner of his force, a point or line drawn in the infinite, a manifest of the imperishable. The supermind shall be his nature's fount. The eternal's truth shall mold his thoughts and acts. The eternal's truth shall be his light and guide. All then shall change. A magic order come, overtopping this mechanical universe. A mightier race shall inhabit the mortal's world. On nature's luminous tops, on the spirit's ground, the Superman shall reign as king of life, make earth almost the maiden peer of heaven, and lead towards God and truth man's ignorant heart, and lift towards Godhead his mortality. Namaste. Jai Ma. To our friends on Zoom, always you're very patient. Thank you for coming with us. It's a long journey. I hope you enjoyed it and will enjoy it at least once more. And then let us see. I think we have more work to do. Much love to you all. Thank you. Good night.